мира и счастья всем вам, друзья мои.
Everyone is my children, Joseph Stalin used to boast when referring to the soldiers of the Red Army. I would not make any distinction between any of them, he pronounced. And indeed, he kept his word. From 1924 until his death in 1953, he was the absolute leader of the Soviet Union. During this period, he ruled the Red Army with an iron fist and played a crucial role in the overwhelming victory over Nazism after World War II. While his role as a dictator is widely known, less so is his family history, which is filled with death, secrets, and cruelty. On April 15, 1943, a young Russian lieutenant approached the electrified fence of a Nazi concentration camp. Despite the guards' shouts for him to retreat, the young man continued forward until he touched the wire and fell dead from a precise German shot. This lieutenant was Yakov Djugashvili, the son Stalin kept hidden for many years, and although he had the opportunity to save him from German clutches, he simply decided to leave him to his own fateful fate. In this new installment of military history, we will uncover the whole truth about Yakov, Joseph Stalin's most hidden secret. Let's begin. Joseph married for the first time in 1905 to Yekaterina Svanidze, affectionately called Kato by those close to her. Out of that great love, Yakov Djugashvili was born in 1907. However, just a few months later, Yekaterina died from tuberculosis and typhus, two fatal diseases of that time. Her passing caused an irreparable rupture in the life of the young revolutionary. In his own words, he wrote that with her, his last hopes had vanished. That woman softened my heart of stone. She is dead, and with her died my last warm feelings towards human beings. Despite the love he had for her, Kato died alone, while the young Stalin devoted all his fighting spirit to the cause of the Bolshevik Party. Lenin himself was impressed with that ruthless underground operator who organized strikes and protests, firmly led guerrillas, and even robbed banks to finance the revolution they were plotting. Absorbed in these matters, which he considered more urgent, he left his young son in the care of relatives residing in Tiflis, Georgia, where Yakov spent much of his childhood. As Joseph continued to build his political career, sponsored by Lenin, whom he held in blind faith, he gradually earned the nickname Man of Steel due to the determination, firmness, and cruelty with which the revolutionary carried out his assignments. This led him in 1912 to change his true surname Vissarionovich Djugashvili to simply Stalin, derived precisely from the Russian word stal, meaning steel, and adding the possessive suffix in used by Lenin himself. It is worth mentioning that he never allowed his eldest son to adopt the new surname. Having proven his usefulness to the cause, Joseph climbed hierarchical positions. He was assigned a post in the Central Committee of the party, which led him to travel to the city of St. Petersburg. There, behind the facade of imperial splendor, existed an underworld of revolutionary groups dedicated to overthrowing the czars, into which Stalin quickly entered. But in 1913, he was caught by the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, and sent to a remote camp beyond the Arctic Circle, where he endured 4 miserable years. Stalin was in exile when World War I broke out, and Russia mobilized millions of troops against Germany, causing a political, social, and military decline that led the imperial regime to collapse. In February 1917, the Tsar was overthrown. Stalin departed for St. Petersburg, hopeful of a socialist future, but power was in the hands of a provisional government. After several revolution attempts orchestrated by Lenin, their big chance came in the famous October of 17. Russia was in crisis, with a crumbling army against the Germans. The Bolsheviks seized the discontent among soldiers in St. Petersburg and staged a coup against the current government. Stalin became a people's commissar in Lenin's government and later joined the inner circle of power, the Politburo. But let's return to the central theme of our video for a moment. Yakov, Stalin's heir, grew up far from his father's revolutionary uproar, under the care of his maternal uncle, who convinced him to study Russian and travel to Moscow to secure a good future. Thus, in 1921, the young boy saw his father for the first time, now 14 years old. Details of that meeting are documented in the book Joseph Stalin, a biographical companion, written by historian Helen Rappaport, which recounts that the revolutionary had remarried and had just welcomed his second son named Vasily. During the encounter between Stalin and Yakov, it became clear that father and son were nothing alike. While the former was cold and calculating, the latter was peaceful, calm, and modest. Perhaps these differences forever marked the strained relationship between them. In May 1922, Lenin suffered the first of a series of strokes. He increasingly relied on Stalin and created a position for him, General Secretary of the Bolshevik Party. Stalin himself wrote the description of his own position, which would make him the most powerful man in the party. Lenin's severe decline meant Stalin's abrupt rise. In 1924, on his deathbed, Lenin was in the process of dictating his last will and testament to the party, which he warned of almost like a devastating premonition. Having become General Secretary, Comrade Stalin has concentrated immeasurable power in his hands, and I am not sure that he will always know how to use it.
نحن في محيط موسكو في منتصف الشتاء الروسي. لينين والد الثورة الشيوعية مات للتو. إنه أحد الأفلام الأولى التي يلعب فيها ستالين دور البطولة. إنه يحمل نعش الشيف إلى جانب المسؤولين السوفييت. ستالين يبلغ من العمر 46 عاماً، وهو الأمين العام للحزب الشيوعي منشور تم محوه نسبياً. بين رفاقه، لا أحد يستطيع أن يتخيل أنه سيكون الشخص الذي سيخلف لينين العظيم.
With control of the party machinery, Stalin began to destroy those who stood in his way to absolute power, starting with Trotsky, the party favorite, whose fame as a charismatic speaker and leader of the victorious Red Army was on par with Lenin himself. Meanwhile, Yakov kept abreast of his father's advances through newspaper reports. The young man had managed to establish close bonds with his stepmother and his half-siblings, Vasily and a young Svetlana. They were the closest thing he had to a family in Moscow until he met Zoya Gunina, the daughter of an Orthodox priest whom Yakov decided to marry. However, the wedding bells only unleashed Stalin's wrath as he vehemently opposed the marriage. Despised by his father, the young man attempted suicide by shooting himself in the heart, but he failed with the bullet grazing his lung. This mistake led to one of the most cutting remarks from the political leader to his eldest son. "You couldn't even do that right." Yakov spent several months in a Moscow hospital until he recovered. Unfortunately for him, Stalin's hatred remained unabated. Despite the obstacles, the two young people married and eventually moved to Leningrad in 1929. However, the young marriage faced another difficult moment. They lost their newborn daughter to pneumonia 8 months later, a loss from which they never recovered, leading to the end of their relationship shortly thereafter. It wasn't until 1937 that Yakov perhaps made the first attempt in his life to earn his father's approval. He enrolled in the artillery academy, but this did little to improve their relationship. Stalin did not hide his tremendous disappointment upon discovering that Yakov's grades were mediocre. Despite this, Yakov graduated and was assigned to a howitzer unit as a lieutenant, aiming to gain experience before receiving a higher command and promotion to captain. But everything changed abruptly on June 22, 1941, with the start of Operation Barbarossa. A contingent of 152 German divisions surged into the Soviet Union with incredible speed and brutal cruelty against the civilian population. From the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, within 10 days, German troops had penetrated hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory.
Товарищи, в тяжелых условиях приходится праздновать сегодня 24-ю годовщину Октябрьской революции. Вероломные нападения немецких разбойников и навязанная нам война создали угрозу для нашей страны. Мы потеряли временно ряд областей. Враг очутился у ворот Ленинграда и Москвы. Враг рассчитывал на то, что после первого же удара наша армия будет рассеяна. Наша страна будет поставлена на колени. Но враг здесь только просчитался.
The repeated orders of no retreat from Soviet leader Joseph Stalin worsened the debacle, condemning one Soviet army after another to annihilation. In this emergency risking the regime, Stalin summoned Yakov and ordered him to go to the front. "Go and fight," he told him through a cold telephone call. Thus, the eldest son of the supreme comrade was forced into battle, despite his hatred for war and violence in all its forms, as recounted in the book, Stalin, An Unknown Portrait. Once again, this is a clear example of Yakov's deep-seated need to be accepted, not by the feared dictator, but by his father. On June 27, 1941, Yakov entered combat and displayed his bravery. However, his unit became isolated by Nazi divisions and suffered a brutal air bombardment. The young man attempted to break through their lines, encountering wounded and disoriented comrades along the way, when he was captured by the Germans. Interestingly, due to not sharing the same last name as the renowned dictator, it took weeks for them to discover who they had captured, and they sought to exploit him to the fullest. He was taken to a mansion near Berlin on the suggestion of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda, who hoped to persuade him to speak on radio broadcasts directed at Russians. Later, they also considered using him as a figurehead for the Russian Liberation Army, a unit of renegades led by Soviet General Andrei Vlasov, who had switched sides. The tyrant learned of his eldest son's capture when a pamphlet dropped by the Luftwaffe was sent to him. Alongside a recent photograph of Yakov was the following message: "Stalin's son has surrendered." The surrender of a high-ranking Soviet officer proves without a doubt that all resistance against the German army is futile. Stop fighting and join us. Upon hearing this, it is reported that Stalin, on one hand, claimed he had no son in the war, but among his intimates and with absolute contempt, he went so far as to assert that Yakov did not even have the courage to shoot himself. From now on, the iron law of discipline for every officer, soldier, and commissar shall be, not a step back without orders from high command. These lines were included in the famous Order 227, made public after the start of Operation Barbarossa, which also stated that officers who surrendered would be considered traitors. The same fate awaited those who survived Nazi torture after enduring lengthy stays in prison. Stalin's deranged theory was that if they hadn't been killed, it was because they had revealed secrets to the enemy. This extended to the families of prisoners, who risked imprisonment as well. Once again, Stalin made no distinction among his soldiers. Yulia Meltzer, Yakov's second wife, was imprisoned in Lefortovo prison for 2 years. A month later, Yakov's maternal uncle, who had cared for him in his childhood, was taken out of the Gulag and executed. Despite receiving preferential treatment, Yakov never cooperated with the Nazis. In numerous interrogations, the Germans not only questioned him about military matters, but also his political opinions, debated Stalin's methods of governing, pointed out his father's mistakes, and highlighted the flaws of Bolshevik ideology. However, they made no progress in their attempts to soften the prisoner of war. Djugashvili refused to cooperate with the Germans in any way. Shortly thereafter, he was sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, to the VIP section of that death factory reserved for political prisoners. They had one bathroom for 5 people, meager but sufficient rations, the obligation to work, and only occasional beatings. Yakov was of high value and was treated with extreme courtesy and civility. His bunkmates included Vasily Kokorin, a nephew of Vyacheslav Molotov, and 4 Irish nationalists forced to fight in the British Army, who upon capture collaborated with the Nazis. Meanwhile, offers for his release continued to reach Joseph Stalin's desk. The Germans proposed exchanging the prisoner twice, first for Leo Rudolf Raubal, Hitler's beloved nephew, and then for Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commander of the 6th Army in the disastrous Battle of Stalingrad. However, Stalin rejected all proposals, viewing it as utterly foolish to exchange a field marshal for a mere lieutenant. Once again, and with complete cruelty, the dictator demonstrated his true contempt for his eldest son. Let's go back to the fateful Wednesday, April 14, 1943, a spring afternoon at the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, north of Berlin. A man jumps from a window in Barrack 3 of the special camp, an area for prominent prisoners separated from the rest of the inmate population. It measures 140 meters long and 50 meters wide, isolated from the main camp by a brick wall. A 2.6-meter high-voltage fence is meant to prevent prisoners from escaping. The man wears high boots and military trousers, with his black hair exposed. "Cabo, Cabo!" he shouts to SS Rottenführer Konrad Hoffrich. "Shoot me!" Hoffrich pressures him to return to the barrack, but the man persists. "Don't be a coward," says the prisoner as he walks towards the electric fence. The guard hesitates with his weapon raised, but as soon as he sees the prisoner grab the cable, he shoots him as ordered. It's just after 9 in the evening, and thus ends the life of Yakov Djugashvili. His body stiffens mid-jump. His left leg is almost horizontal on the wire trap, and the right leg is bent. The body remains in this position for a considerable time. This becomes a sensitive case for the camp commander, Anton Kindl, who notifies the Reich Central Security Office in Berlin. The next day, an SS officer and 2 professors arrive, photograph Yakov's body, remove him from the barbed wire, and take him to the camp crematorium. Forensic experts examine the body. In their report, they write that a bullet entered the head 4 centimeters behind the right ear and shattered the skull. However, they assess that the victim had already died from electrocution by the high-voltage fence. The body is promptly cremated, and the urn is sent to the Reich Central Security Office, along with the investigation report and death certificate. 8 days later, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Joachim von Ribbentrop, receives a Reich Secret Matters issue from SS Chief Heinrich Himmler. It states, "Dear Ribbentrop, I enclose a report regarding the fact that prisoner of war Yakov Djugashvili, son of Stalin, was shot dead during an escape attempt at Special Camp A in Sachsenhausen, near Oranienburg." After the war, the Americans found the SS report explaining the incident. They were about to hand it over to Stalin during the Victorious Leaders Conference in Potsdam, held in July 1945, but they did not want the Soviets to know they had taken entire crates of camp documents. The Soviet leader suspected his son had died, but he never had confirmation. Curiously, contrary to his interest in saving him during his life, after his death, Stalin seemed to search for him. In 1951, a report in the British newspaper Daily Telegraph stated that Russian authorities were offering 1 million rubles to anyone with information on the fate or whereabouts of Yakov. Did remorse for the cruel abandonment of his eldest son haunt him? That we will never know. The body of the dictator responsible for the deaths of between 3 and 20 million people, according to estimates, was embalmed and displayed alongside Lenin's, hailed as a hero by followers of Marxism and communism worldwide. Stalin had undoubtedly been a man of war, but never a family man. This macabre reverence for his person persisted until 1961, when he was finally buried under an imposing white marble statue. In stark contrast to the final fate of his son, the traitor Yakov Djugashvili, which remains a mystery as his ashes rest in an entirely unknown location. That concludes today's video. We invite you to share this account so that more people can firsthand learn about the tragic story of Stalin's son and the dark circumstances surrounding his last days in a Nazi concentration camp. We appreciate your interest and for joining us on this journey through military history.